Hello all, we've brought you here today to present the risks associated with our organization and what needs to be done to combat them. This presentation is intended to define the weaknesses of the organization's security identity and practices. It will also describe and incorporate current best practices for authentication, authorization, and access control. In doing so, we will be able to identify protective mitigation measures for existing risks. When looking at the security of the organization, various weaknesses raise concern in areas of people, policies, and technology. These vulnerabilities need to be mitigated so that there are minimal risks associated with intrusion, natural disasters, and other disruptions of daily operations. To begin, the organization lacks an incident response plan. Without an incident response plan, there is no strategy for restoration in the event of an attack that allows unauthorized users access to the organization's systems. When a disruption occurs, operations are likely to be halted for a detrimental amount of time and end up costing the organization a substantial amount of money, resources, and their integrity. Currently, users' primary usernames and passwords come from an Active Directory. This means the same username and password are used across different requests, including logging into the system as a whole. Using the same username and password for multiple applications heightens the risk of an attack. If one set of usernames and passwords are exposed, hackers are able to infiltrate the entirety of a system through one account. Passwords also have a maximum character amount of 8, which leaves them weak and vulnerable to brute force and other password-targeted attacks. The system also lacks a security information and event manager, also known as an SIEM, so there is no automated monitoring of networks and services. When looking into the system, it has also been discovered that there are various Microsoft cloud-based accounts that have been inactive for the past 180 days. These accounts have access to global administrator role permissions, and if they are not disabled, they can heighten the risk of potential and anomalous logins and activities that can go unnoticed due to lack of monitoring. It is important to look at the weaknesses that come from cross-account access. Members with privileged access are able to enter the test and production stages of a system. This raises a concern because if an intrusion occurs in the design stage, hackers will be able to gain access to private and sensitive information, threatening the confidentiality of that information. Next up, administrators currently use unverified structured query language, also known as SQL, injection practices from the internet. If hackers notice this activity, they can easily attempt to get around security measures through a backdoor, hijack, and gain access to high-level user information. We spoke about password weaknesses. Now let's get into troubles that can be run into in the event an authorized user forgets their password. If this occurs, users are not given a way to individually reset their account passcodes and can be locked out for some time. This leaves room for an unauthorized user to infiltrate the system, impersonate that end user, reset their password, and gain access to internal resources. Lastly, the organization lacks sufficient internal policies to define and outline acceptable and unacceptable user practices. There is also a lack of documentation when it comes to standard system and operating procedures. This means that the average user has no guidance when it comes to attempting to secure the systems. This is extremely detrimental as users should be considered the frontline protectors of the system. Because the organization showcases risk levels that threaten the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information systems, we need to look at some of the best current industry practices regarding authentication, authorization, and access control so that we can determine strong approaches to mitigating these risks. We will start by looking at authentication practices. We can start by looking into user identification or user IDs best practices. User IDs should not be case sensitive and should also be unique. In instances of higher security accessibility, usernames can be assigned in secret so that they are not easily identifiable pieces of information. A strong password policy also makes it difficult for an unknown user to guess a password through manual or automated means. In order to create strong passwords, they should be compared to stored password hashing using a secure password comparison function. The comparison function should incorporate minimum input lengths to avoid the use of weak passwords. Passwords should also require a maximum input length. This ensures passwords are protected against denial of service attacks that incorporate lengthy inputs. Before updating sensitive account information such as emails on file and passwords, there should be a requirement to enter current user credentials. This helps mitigate attack methods such as session hijacking. Without proper security measures, attackers may be able to get temporary access to a user's browser or ID to take over their session. User accounts are most commonly compromised due to weak or reused passwords. Multi-factor authentication is one of the strongest defenses against almost all password-related attacks. This is because it requires an authorized user to present more than one type of evidence in order to authenticate themselves on a system. Along with multi-factor authentication, the most common protection against automated attacks is known as an account lockout. This describes the prevention of numerous login attempts for a specific period of time after a certain number of unsuccessful logins. The account lockout policy should consider the number of failed logins allowed prior to an account lockout. It should also consider the time period attempts need to occur within. And lastly, it is necessary that it considers the amount of time an account will be set to lock out for. This is known as the lockout duration. Next, we can get into authorization best practices. It is necessary to assign users only the minimal privileges needed to access resources to complete their specific line of work. Though users may belong to different departments that occupy the same level of hierarchy within an organization, they will typically require access to different resources to perform their duties. Least privileges should be implemented horizontally and vertically within the organization. It should be considered that managers of departments are likely to need more privilege access than employees working within those departments. In enforcing least privileges, organizations are less likely to jeopardize the confidentiality of sensitive information. Think of it this way. It is better to grant users additional privileges down the line than take away some of them that have been previously granted. The implementation of least privileges should occur earlier in the software development lifecycle. This will help reduce the risk of needing to revoke permissions that are deemed too broad in later times after software deployment. For security purposes, applications should always make the decision to deny or permit requested access. Because logic errors and mistakes relating to access control are usual, an application should be configured to deny access by default. This restricts local network traffic to only that which is absolutely necessary. Precise validation on permissions should occur with every request. It is not sufficient to validate permissions on the majority of requests because an attacker only needs to find one way into the system. Even when only a single access control scan is missed, the confidentiality and integrity of resources can be jeopardized. During the design phase of an application, ensure that trust boundaries are clearly defined. This means defining the type of users that will be accessing the system, the resources that can be accessed, and operations that are allowed to be performed on those resources. Organizations should also create and perform testing that validates the permissions created in the design phase to ensure they are being enforced correctly even after deployment. Lastly, we can get into the best practices for access controls. Applications need access controls to allow users the varying privileges to use it. In having an access control policy, an organization can clearly describe to its architects, designers, developers, and support teams the security requirements so that access control functionality is designed and implemented successfully. For one, there is role-based access control, which access is based on individuals' roles and responsibilities within the organization. Defining roles depends on analyzing the goals and structure of the organization and is linked to the security policy. This framework provides security administrators the ability to determine who can perform what actions, from where, in what order, and under what relational circumstances. Role-based access control considers principles like segregation of duties and least privileges, is easy to use and administer, and is built into most frameworks. Next comes discretionary access controls. These restrict access to information based on the identity of the user. Decisions about access are based on authorizations granted to the user and based on the credentials they present, and the owner of the information can change permissions at their discretion. This specific model allows objects owners total discretion over the access that can be granted. Mandatory access controls are also considered. This form of strategy makes it so that the enforcement of the organization's security policy does not rely on voluntary application user compliance. It secures information by assigning its sensitivity labels and compares it to the level of sensitivity a specific user is operating at. It is typically used in extremely secure systems to include multi-level secure military applications and mission-critical data applications. In using this methodology, only an administrator can grant access, and access granted is strictly based on a need to know. Lastly, we can consider permission-based access control. Its key concept is conceptualizing application actions into a set of permissions. This means user access decisions are made by looking into whether or not a user has been given the permission associated with a requested application action. It is now time to lay out the recommendations for mitigation when it comes to our security weaknesses. When it comes to the lack of incident response plans, it is recommended that we accept some risks. An incident response plan should definitely be created. Though it does not guarantee a system will not be targeted, creating a plan beforehand will lessen the amount of time it will take to respond to a security incident, as well as assist in smoothing business continuity after one occurs. We should also mitigate all risks when it comes to the usage of an Active Directory. A password strength meter should be set in place to require authorized users to create more complex passwords with an 8-character minimum and 64-character maximum. Setting a maximum length helps prevent long password of denial attacks. Using the meter will also help prevent the use of common and previously breached passwords. Microsoft cloud-based accounts should be mitigated with acceptance of some risks. Cloud-based accounts should be allowed, but there should be continuous administrative monitoring in place to inspect accounts and delete them after 72 hours of inactivity. This will lessen the chances of a hacker gaining access through backdoors. Privileged accounts should be mitigated with consideration to all risks. Login to sensitive accounts should be prohibited to any front-end user interface. Sensitive accounts describe any accounts that are used for the back-end, middleware, or database. We need to mitigate all risks when it comes to unverified administrative SQL injections. We need to prohibit the use of dynamic SQL language and only allow parameterized queries and prepared statements to block unauthorized users from accessing the system with their own attempts of injections. We should mitigate all risks when it comes to password reset protocols. Systems should have a tool that provides users access to their authorized accounts, even in the event of a forgotten password. In doing so, we can ensure they are not permanently locked out of accounts necessary to complete their daily tasks. Lastly, we can mitigate all lack of sufficient internal security policies. The organization's administrators need to set internal policies that require best practices when it comes to authentication, authorization, and access control. In setting such policies, the organization sets the necessary precedent that rules are non-negotiable and must be followed in order to use systems for daily operations. This is a vital step in creating an organizational culture that prioritizes the protection and security of information systems. In conclusion, it is imperative that organizations have security requirements set in place to protect their assets against potential threats. When establishing these requirements, organizations need to identify the resources that need protection so that they are able to allocate measures to eliminate exploitation. Processes and procedures for monitoring and auditing resources must be clearly defined, and tools for identifying, reacting to, and documenting security events need to be established. Making sure that access control monitoring and management tools are set in place is necessary to the success of an effective security operations plan. It is crucial that organizations never assume they are completely protected, even with an effective security posture in place. They should always prepare for potential disruptions and document procedures that should be followed if any scenario should become a reality.